Hello, and welcome to Islington Mill and, the monthly podcast series about the cultural life and times of one of the UK's most beloved artist-led creative hubs, Salford's Islington Mill. This month on Islington Mill and, I am joined again by guest Jen Wilson. Jen appeared on last month's podcast about upwording, where one of the issues that we talked about was consent. And for this month's podcast, I invited Jen back on, just with me, to talk about their project, the International Day of Consent. Jen describes themselves as a performance artist, a writer, facilitator, activist, and therapeutic coach. And this Thursday at Islington Mill, Jen will be hosting and presenting the International Day of Consent with a series of events throughout the day that include a question and answer session with themselves and some other folks, a performance piece based on Jen's personal experience of consent, and also the launch of the Consent Compass, which sounds really cool, and we will be talking about that in more detail over the course of this podcast. I'll be giving links to where you can find details of these events at the end of the podcast, and also some additional links to find out more information about International Day of Consent and the general consent culture larger picture / social movement. Consent is a very important topic, especially in our current political situation, I feel. So having touched on this a bit last month with the Upwarding podcast, I was very excited to get Jen back on to talk about International Day of Consent, but also consent culture more generally in a lot more depth. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand myself over to myself with our special guest for this month's Islington Mill and Jen Wilson of the International Day of Consent. And I'd just like to point out that this is the first ever Islington Mill and podcast that I've done via Zoom. So the audio quality might be a bit different to what you're usually used to hearing on the podcast, as it was recorded electronically rather than face-to-face, which is what this podcast is normally, the format this podcast normally has. But I'm very excited to share with you the content. So, again, with even less ado, here is myself and Jen, handing over to myself right now. Jen Wilson, welcome back to Islington Mill and. You were on last month's edition of this podcast, which was the third part in our ongoing Upwarding series. So welcome back.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm all right, yeah. Very, very busy with the run-up to the International Day of Consent at the end of the month, which I'm looking forward to coming to the mill for. Yeah.
When is the date of the International Day of Consent?
It's the 30th of November.
30th of November, great. So we did mention, we kind of talked in not great detail about the International Day of Consent, but let's just go back to the start. Can you tell me and the listeners what is the even though the name is quite self-explanatory, I think, can you tell us what is the International Day of Consent?
Yeah, it's I founded the day in 2018, and it is a day to bring a global focus to the practice of consent and to consent culture. So what's important about consent to me is that a lot of times when I'm talking to people about consent, they think that I'm talking about sexual consent only, or they think that I'm talking about very transactional stuff, like when you tick a box that says, yes, you can take my photo, or yes, I agree to the terms and conditions, kind of giving consent on a little quick tick box.
Allow cookies.
Yeah, all of that stuff. And that is not what I'm talking about. In fact, obviously sexual consent is part of consent, but it's just one arena in which consent is at play. For me, consent is about all of the agency, all of the free will, all of the choices and decisions that any individual makes. And it is very, very aligned, as we were talking about a little bit in the Upwording session last time, to consensus. And for me, it's about connection and about finding ways to move forward together, whether that's yourself and another individual or yourself and the whole world. Like, how do we connect? How do we find consensus? How do we find common ground and community? How do we build that? So for me, the International Day of Consent is about talking about all of that, not just about how do you navigate your bodily autonomy in an intimate situation. That's part of it, but it's really not the only part of it.
Yeah, that's interesting, because consent it's quite buzzy right now in terms of like an idea, I feel like, especially online, especially in certain online spaces. But that's really interesting what you were saying about what it means, the idea of what consent is being a lot broader than just physical autonomy consent. Because I think when I think about consent right now, I think about that stuff, actually. I think that feels like the most kind of like not relevant, but like the most kind of in your face aspect of consent that kind of people are dealing with at the moment, which is that, like, I don't know how to classify that, but the kind of like personal physical consent kind of thing as well. So it is really interesting thinking about the larger picture of consent. Could you expand on that a bit more? Like, I want to come back to the kind of like those kind of more intimate physical consent things in a bit, but it is really interesting talking about consent in a larger picture and a larger framework. Like, could you expand on that?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, consent operates. I talk about it operating on 4 levels just to kind of simplify it, but I don't think it is as simple as that. But the 4 levels are quite useful. And the first one is the things you consent to for yourself in your own internal dialogue. And upwarding is very much around that. For me as a practice, is very much about the times when I hear myself say I should do that or I have to do this, is checking my own self-coercion in my internal dialogue that says that, these are the things that I have to do and I must do, and that I should do, and also the things that I can't do and that I'm not allowed to do and that people like me can't do. And so there's a whole load of cultural assumptions going on in our own inner dialogue about what we are and aren't allowed to do as individuals. Then the next level is the interpersonal. So how what I decide I want and am willing to do relates to what the person I'm relating to, whether that's someone I'm in an intimate situation with or someone I'm on a podcast conversation with, or someone I'm in a shop with, or whatever it is. That's still an interpersonal interaction. And then there's group consensus. So there's an awful lot of stuff going on at the level of group dynamics, of peer pressure, of certain subcultures or social groups having different rules than others. And sometimes those are really, really explicit written rules, like maybe you join a club. I talk a lot in consent with people who are into tabletop role-playing games, for example. And there's a whole load of like rules and procedures and agreements about who can do what and who can say what and all of that kind of thing. Whereas other groups, it's very, very unwritten. It's like the culture of the group of parents outside the school gates, or the culture of being in a nightclub, or the culture of being in a workplace. They're all very different, and most of us are fairly familiar and used to navigating those different group dynamics. But those are consensuses, those group dynamics. And then the 4th level for me is the social, cultural, systemic. And in that context, I think we have a fundamental challenge, because actually most of us are firmly outside of consent at the get-go, because we live inside coercive, hierarchical, power-driven inequity, and some people have power over other people. And so how much totally free will, total freedom you have to do whatever you want at that level, that then goes back to the inner dialogue, doesn't it? It goes back to, people like me, and the assumptions we make about one another in the context of our culture, of our system. So I think consent is operating across all of those levels. And for me, one of the most important things about consent, and one of the reasons I arrived at it as a thing that I wanted to focus on in my work, is that feeling that I think most of us have at the moment of, well, what does it matter what I do? The world's just
Yeah.
broken. It's
Yeah.
such a mess. There's
Mhm.
so much horrible, horrible, horrible stuff going on. How can what I do have any meaning whatsoever? And actually, if you think of the personal as political or the political as personal, and if you
Mhm.
think about your own personal agency and the things that you give yourself permission to do, that's all part of that bigger, wider socio-cultural systemic consensus. And
Mhm.
we can consent to be part of it, or we consent to rebel against it in
Yeah.
our own little tiny ways, and they make a difference.
Yeah.
How I parent my children makes a difference.
Yeah.
How I relate to people in my work environment makes a difference. It's not going to solve the problems in Palestine,
Mm.
but it does make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really fascinating. I don't think I've actually thought about those various different levels of consent that you just mentioned. Well, it makes perfect sense. And can I just dial back a little bit? And you said that like it's why you're so interested in consent in your work. Can you tell us what you
Mm.
do in terms of
Oh
how
yeah.
have you how have you come to doing International Day of Consent?
Well, first and foremost, I'm an artist and a performer and a writer. And I founded the Day of Consent because I was doing a scratch performance piece about consent on the 30th of November
Ooh.
2018, and went, today's the first International Day of Consent, and it was me and 40 people in a room in Bradford.
Yeah.
Um, and then the following year, I did an international festival in Leeds. And it was international because Rivka, in fact, from Upwarding and the
Hmm.
Mill, was in, I think, somewhere in South America at the time, and dialed in
Yeah.
over Zoom to talk to the room of people in Leeds. And there was also some connection with consent work that was happening in other parts of the world. Um, Fast forward 2020, an international online festival happened because we were in lockdown. And the lockdown enabled me to connect with consent activists across the world, particularly in the States. So I've connected with Kitty Stryker, who was one of the pioneers of the term consent culture.
Okay.
Um, and subsequently, I've also started a dialogue with Betty Martin, who is well known for her Wheel of Consent, which is a practice for embodied consent, and others. So yeah, it's kind of grown into an international thing, like I hoped it would, and I kind
Mm.
of have stuck with it on the basis that if I keep championing it, eventually one day maybe the United Nations will take it on. But
That's a
going
very
back
laudable
to,
aim.
yeah, I'm gonna, why not? Because
Mm.
we can all make a little difference. And I think that's, you asked, what do I do? Who am I? I mean, I'm an artist. I am a parent. I am a person who is queer and neurodivergent. I am someone who does therapeutic coaching work. I am someone who writes blogs and activist pieces and networks with all kinds of people. I've never just done art for art's sake. I've always done it with an intention to communicate and make a difference in the world.
Hmm.
So that's who I am. I'm irregular Jen is my
Irregular
kind of
Jen.
People go, what?
um,
But my mother's sort of like, I wish you were just a dentist so I could just say you're a dentist. It's really hard to explain what it is I do.
yeah. Oh, I think my parents are probably similar as well. I come from a
Mm.
long line of pharmacists, and I know that they were like disappointed that I didn't go into pharmacy. But here I am making
Yes,
podcasts at Islington Mill.
yes.
But I'm yeah. So I need to profess a bit of ignorance here because I didn't know. I've heard the term consent culture in the past. I've heard it, but I didn't really realize how developed it is. And you were mentioning other activists who are like deeply involved in this kind of thing. Um,
Mm.
yeah, could you just expand a bit on that in terms of what is consent culture right now and what is going on in the broader terms. There's another question here that I'm going to come back to in a bit, which is the kind of opposition between the personal and the political, and how a certain amount of focus is given to the personal to, I feel, obfuscate the political. But what I want to ask right now is, so what is consent culture right now? And could you maybe expand on what the activists that you've been in touch with, what they do, and what is going on in terms of what is happening with consent at the moment? Because, like I say, I feel like we're talk a lot about consent in the interpersonal relationships, but it's such a big picture in terms of like the societal aspect of it as well. And I'm just kind of curious to know what is happening in terms of consent culture in general these days.
I feel like to some extent I am a bit of an outlier in having the very, very broad set of definitions around consent that I do. And certainly Kitty Stryker's work originated out of BDSM and kink culture and problems in those communities, and consent culture as a term coming up as an antithesis, an opposite to rape culture, and to challenge the kind of cultural everyday sexism through to serious assaults and pussy grabbing presidents and all of that bullshit. So I think that I suppose what's happening in consent culture is that, as opposed to that simplistic definition of consent as being a transactional thing in the bedroom. And what I really think is problematic, and where consent culture departs from a lot of consent education, is where consent is seen as and described as a thing that someone has to get from someone else in order to proceed. And that is very often simplified down into, I got consent and therefore I could continue. And it therefore isn't seen as this ongoing thing.
Yes.
It's very easy, if you start to talk in those very transactional terms, to think of it as being a one-time tick box deal, like I agreed to the terms and conditions thing, rather than a practice that is ongoing in relation to someone. So I think consent culture is really important work in terms of broadening that understanding of consent beyond the yes means yes, no means no simplicity, and into actually this is about shifting a culture. The problems we have with consent are down to patriarchy and other power structures and cultural systems that encourage certain people to behave in certain ways and to have certain expectations, and other people to have other expectations. So, the prevailing story of society that binaries people into men and women and says, someone was quoted to me saying, men use love to get sex and women use sex to get love. And I think that horror of a sentence is like almost the essence of what was talked about as rape culture, or I would call that entitlement culture perhaps now, rather than rape culture.
I like that term, entitlement culture. That's a good, I feel that that's a better flip of consensus, or consent culture is entitlement culture, because it is interesting what you were saying there about how consent is seen as this very binary thing. And I think that is very relevant, though, in certain cases, like for sex workers and people involved in the sex industry and stuff. That is an interesting thing, and that is something that has happened to me in my own past as somebody who produces adult material, in terms of somebody consenting to something at a certain point and then down the line withdrawing their consent, and having to respect the fact that even though they consented at a certain point, at another point they then withdrew that, so I wasn't able to proceed with producing the materials that we had agreed that we would put out. And that was and I had a long discussion with my partner about that, and he was the one who explained to me that you should be able to withdraw your consent if you want to, even if you've given, it was verbal consent that was given at this point, but then the person withdrew it. And it was like, well, I don't have written consent, so I just have to go with whatever the latest verbal transaction we have had. And at that point, they were like, I don't want that going out. It's like, okay, we spent money producing that, but you've withdrawn your consent. So legally, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, well, and also ethically, by the sounds of it, in that particular situation. But I think that there's a really, that this simplistic binary view of consent often misses out those subtleties and those nuances in really significant and important ways, which is why I've come up with the consent compass as a model.
You mentioned this in the upwarding, and this is something that I want to speak to you about. Yeah, can you explain what this is?
Yeah, so it's a model that I've designed and tested in a range of different contexts and settings, from things like sexual consent, but and I've spoken to sex workers, and I've spoken to kinky people and that kind of thing. But also, I've also tested out this model with academics. I've tested it out with doing a workshop with adults with severe learning disabilities. I've done it in the context of parenting. I've tried to apply the model in lots of different contexts and check that it kind of works. It's not perfect. And I think anyone who holds themselves up as the consent person who knows how to do it is dodgy as heck.
Yeah, okay.
I just think saying that I know how to do consent is like the worst possible thing you could say. It's almost like a paradox. But anyway, so the compass is about equipping people with a sort of aid memoir to help them work out, is this consensual or not in any given situation?
Yeah.
Now, in a day-to-day situation where there's not much jeopardy, like we're recording a podcast together, there's not an awful lot of consent that we need to check. I mean, like, you needed to check that I was okay with being recorded and where the podcast would go and that sort of thing. But, you know, there's very little chance that either one of us is going to cause harm to the other one in this interaction.
Yeah.
So we don't need to be navigating consent very, very fully and aware and intentional. However, in some situations where it's unfamiliar, it's someone you've never met before, it's something you've never done before, and there is potential for someone to be harmed, then you need to really kind of up your game and be more aware of what you're doing, whether it's consensual or not. So the compass, describe it. It will be launched on the day of consent, and there'll be stuff online on my website that we can signpost people to, with a video of me explaining it and some written stuff. And I am also writing a whole book on this.
Oh, great.
But that won't be till next year.
Okay.
But so the compass starts with our agency. So our personal agency to make decisions is in the center of the compass. And the outer ring of the compass, if you can imagine a compass in your brain, is accountability, ability to account for oneself. And the reason for that is because I think that almost every human being, even very young children, have some degree of agency, some degree of ability to say, no, I'm not okay with that. And yes, I am okay with that. But their ability, the amount of agency and capacity and license they have to be heard is limited as a small child.
Okay.
And so is their accountability. You know, my 12-year-old kid has a lot more agency than a 3-year-old kid. Yeah. But if my 12-year-old kid harms someone or does something problematic, then as their parent, I am somewhat responsible for that, and I have the ability to account for my child's actions, and that's how that works. And I think that when you have a fundamental imbalance between the amount of agency a person has and the amount of willingness they have to account for their actions, then you have a problem in consent. If you think of an example, if you have a lot of agency because you are someone in a position of power and authority, and people are doing as they're told because you have that power and authority, or they perceive you to have that power and authority, and you tell them to do stuff that they're not that comfortable with, but they feel like they have to because you've got the power, and that causes someone harm, then you, as the powerful person that encouraged them to do it, are the person that should be accounting for the problem that happened.
Yes.
Now, if you're unwilling to do that, and you're like, well, they did it.
Yeah.
It wasn't me. I'm not. I'm not the person. Then you're outside of consent, very likely.
That's really interesting. I'm just trying to. That relates back to power in my mind when we're talking about this now, because power is the ability to deny that you are the person who is responsible for that. As I see it, it's the ability to kind of make things invisible. So the power that you had to coerce a person into doing that, you're then entitled to deny it, and that is power. And you can shift the blame onto the person. So that's really interesting, that focusing the accountability back onto the people in power, which, I think in the world we're living in today, specifically with this country and the politics that are happening right now, is a massive, massive imbalance. And it's what everybody is seeing and feeling, is that there is absolutely no accountability there by the people who wield this power.
Absolutely. And this is the absence of consent in our culture. And this is very, very important.
Yeah.
At that systemic level, it's absolutely fundamental. In interpersonal interaction, or at the level of small groups and workplace culture and that kind of thing, it's maybe more tackleable.
Yeah.
But even then, sometimes not. Sometimes there are situations where someone wields power over another person, and their agency is so diminished that they can't consent.
Even in workplace, and also you just mentioned it there, but social groups, specifically small social groups that may be activist or that have come together around specific kind of justice issues or social issues like that. Even in those groups, I personally feel that power is something that's never talked about. Again, it's invisibilized, it's made invisible, and that allows people who have an imbalance of power, who hold an imbalance of power, to retain that because it's just not talked about. It's
Indeed.
Maybe it's just my own personal experience, and I've not kind of interacted with the right justice-based social groups and stuff. But I just feel like traditional power dynamics still happen within these groups that are supposed to be about questioning those things, because actually the dialogue that should be happening, which is talking about power and talking about broader consent, not just interpersonal consent in, for instance, a sexual relationship, it's just not talked about. And it's really, really nice to actually hear somebody talking about this, but also the theoretical, how have we got here? How have we ended up in these situations?
I mean, there's that great Audre Lorde phrase. I can't quote it quite accurately, but something about you can't dismantle the master's house with the tools of the master.
Tools.
And I think that's the challenge. We're so culturally enmeshed in a lack of consent that even in what are attempting to be socially just situations, those patterns play out. And I hope that the consent compass gives people a tool to talk about it and to go, well, hang on a minute, not because I think one of the dangerous things that happens is shaming and blaming and going, you did it wrong and you're evil and you're a this and you're a that, and falling apart with inside actually this is a group of people that all want the same thing. So why are we arguing with each other? That's the last thing any of us want, right? Whereas I think holding one another accountable, and calling in and and finding ways to navigate towards consensus and moving forward in a place where everybody's comfortable to move forward. I think that changes our social justice movements in a really fundamentally important way. And I think that that's a big part of why I do the work I do, is to try and enable those conversations and stop the us and them happening in the places where there really isn't an us and them. This is really about us finding common ground. So the arrow on the compass is always pointing towards connection. It's always pointing towards consensus, connection. We are looking for the common good, the common ground where everyone is comfortable to move forward. That's the direction of consent.
Okay. So back to the compass. In my mind, a compass, you've described the kind of like, just a second.
Oh, you've got
saying I'm running out of time.
On your Zoom meeting?
Yes, we have basically 10 minutes left.
Okay.
I'll just go with it. And if there's more to talk about, I'll just restart it. I know how to I'll pause it and restart it. But okay. So back to the compass. In my mind, a compass has got different planes. So there's vertical, horizontal, lateral, etc. And I feel like you've described the horizontal plane. Is there what more is sorry, but you know what I'm saying? Okay,
there's a lot. I do. So the compass, so far we've got the central pin and the outer shell of this gadget. So the central pin is agency, your personal agency. The outer case is your ability to account for your actions, and the due north, the place that the arrow is always pointing, is towards connection, consensus, common ground. Then on a compass, you have northeast, south, and west. And on my compass, you have 4 points. And in order to move towards consent, you need to know where you are in relation to all 4 points on the compass.
Yes.
All of them are simultaneously important.
Yeah.
It's not like you're moving towards one and not another, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
We're always moving towards connection. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah.
So and the points on the compass spell out the word rise. So together with the agency and accountability, if you like, you can have arise as an aid memoir. And the R is, I'll talk about them in more detail. The R is responsive. Consent needs to be responsive, not fixed. That's the situation you were talking about.
Yep.
The I is informed. You need to understand what you're consenting to. The S is specific. So it's this particular situation, set of people's time, space, circumstance.
Sure.
And E is explicit. So it's communicated and understood by all the people involved in that, whatever it is. So those, by having all 4 of those in place, and you're aware of all 4 of those being there, then you know you're moving through consent and not moving out of consent, because you're aware you've got all 4 of those present. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does actually. And I'm thinking, it's a compass. So you're constantly moving towards consent, but you're using the pointers on the compass to navigate how to move towards that. So consent isn't actually on the compass. Consent is the destination.
Yeah, consent, consensus, connection, common ground is always what you're trying to move towards. Yeah. And you may well wander off. We all mess it up all the time. And the compass helps us get back on course. Okay. Helps us stay accountable, helps us think about, hang on a minute. I've stepped a little bit outside of this. Let's just see what I need to do to bring myself back into safe, common, helpful, chosen way forward. Yeah.
Shall we go through rise then? Because that was a lot to take in. It all makes sense, but can you go through that?
It is a lot. Yeah, it is a lot. And as I say, there will be a resource on my website that helps people to see this visually. Yeah. So consent needs all 4 points. Responsive. So responsive consent is this thing that I was saying before about, it's not a one-time deal, tick box. Yep, got your consent. Now I can move on and get on with it. It's live in the moment, constantly negotiating. Change is constant. You can be happily doing something and then somebody suddenly is hungry, feels ill, is too hot, the wind's changed, someone else has walked in the room, has had a thought, has heard a music, whatever it is, has changed what's going on for one of the people in this situation, or for yourself if it's your own personal consent. What you were happy to do 5 minutes ago, you're suddenly not happy to do right now because of something. So responsive to that constant change is one of the things. That replaces other models. There's a really good model called Fry's, which I won't go into the detail of, but it's a really good model for just sexual consent.
Okay.
They use reversible, and it talks to the thing that you were talking about of you can change your mind. There is a point at which you can go, yes, actually, no. I think it's really important to be clear where the end point is, though, and I think that's the trouble you got into in your example of at what point can that consent be withdrawn? Because if the film's in the can, is that the end of it? Is you putting the film out into the internet, is that the end of it? Or could they 20 years down the line go, I want you to remove all traces of it from existence as best you possibly can? You know, at what point does that stop? So that's responsive. I is informed. And so informed consent, the challenge with informed consent is that you don't know what you don't know until you suddenly realize you don't know it. So it's not, you don't always know what questions to ask at the outset of something. Like, shall we have a pizza? Yeah, sure, let's have a pizza. I've got a pizza, here it is, it's got pineapple on it. Pineapple's the great divider. I often use pizza as an example. So being curious. So instead of shall we have a pizza? Yeah, let's have a pizza. It's like, well, what do you want on the pizza? Well, I don't know. What do you want? What would you like? And a negotiation.
The eternal conversation. What do you want on your pizza? I don't know. What do you want?
But like knowing which questions to ask and checking out whether the people that you're navigating consent with are curious. Curiosity is the key to informed consent, I think.
Cool.
S, specific. So if we go back to the pizza, it's I'm sharing a pizza with you, and that's got pineapple on that section, but not on that section. But I'm not sharing it with Rivka today, and I'm not sharing it with, so it's being really clear about where the limits and the boundaries and the edges and the specifics of that are. You agreed to have a pizza with me today, but that doesn't mean that we get to eat pizza together every Monday, forever. It's that thing. And then explicit communication, and communication requires the navigation of different people's communication needs and the nuances of all of the things of communication. So body language, tone, perceptions of power, social capital. There's lots going on in communication that can make the rest of it go wonky if you're not sure. So it's that repeatedly checking in. It was a green light a minute ago. Is it still? Are we still good? Are we okay? And you don't necessarily need to go, are you still okay? Can I do this? Is it all right? Sometimes you can navigate that through having set up things like, if this is not okay, raise your hand, or knowing safe words, body language. There's lots of ways to navigate that communication, but it's being clear that you are in green light territory, and noticing when you might be in kind of like, oh, hang on a minute, the amber light's coming on, we need to just check this out again. So it's all 4 of those points on the compass.
Okay, cool. There is some, I did mention this before in terms of the kind of relationship between interpersonal consent and then also kind of a greater societal consent. And I don't know, my personal feeling on that is that there's so much focus on interpersonal consent at the moment, which it's valid, it's very valid, and it's an important conversation that needs to happen. But I do question the kind of like
societal consent, or the lack of societal consent that we're in at the moment. And I'm wondering if, like, I don't know, is there any kind of critique of consent culture in terms of it's too focused on one specific aspect and not enough on another? Is that maybe, or is that something you could talk to, or you not? If you don't want to, that's fine.
No, it's not. It's not that I don't want to. I'm not aware of it really.
Okay.
I mean, I suppose. I mean, I've written a thing that I call the Consent Culture Manifesto, and I am purely co-opting that term into this broader definition, rather than critiquing consent culture and critiquing those people who are doing, frankly, most of them are doing really interesting and useful work on the level of how helping individuals to navigate their own consent and their relationships with others more safely and with more intimacy and care. So I'm not interested in dissing people who are doing that at all. I think that's great work. And it's important work. What I'm doing is going, I love your methodology. Now let's apply it to this and this and this and this.
Well, let me rephrase that then. My language was off there because it's not necessarily critique, and I don't want to make it seem like these people are wrong in any way. So yeah, that was my bad in framing it there as critique. But what I'm trying to get at, I think, is those people are great at speaking about consent in a specific realm, but it exists in so many aspects of our daily lives, and also I feel in ways that we don't really acknowledge. And perhaps it's got to do with the lack of education around what consent means. But I also feel like, well, it's very useful for a certain set of people who have a specific amount of power that it's not acknowledged. And it's kept kind of unspoken about. So, yeah, what I'm trying to say, I think, is, where is, within consent culture, where is the conversation at regarding those kind of more macro visions of consent, of societal consent, and how it relates to power, and not in an interpersonal way where that can be discussed between individuals, but in a more broader kind of, this kind of invisibleness thing that I think about a lot.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people having those conversations, but not necessarily framing it as consent.
Okay.
As far as I've found in the world, and I'm not encyclopedic or in my knowledge, I have plenty of limits. I think I'm possibly the only person talking about it in these terms as consent, but I think there is some amazing work out there around system and strategy and disruption. For example, off the top of my head, one of the most interesting people on that, I think, is Adrienne Maree Brown, who is a Black, I think, woman, maybe non-binary, in the States, who writes a book called Emergent Strategy. And there's a website for Emergent Strategy. And that is very much about finding new tools, not the master's tools, finding new ways of navigating activism and building community in ways that will disrupt the systemic problems that we've got. And I think that works brilliant. I think also her name escapes me, the woman who founded the Me Too movement, again a Black woman in America, her work also is about disrupting traditional systemic ways of looking at things. And I think Tarana Burke, amazing person. And also Brené Brown, very populist Brené Brown, and certainly has her limits. But what I like about Brené Brown is that she's extremely accessible. She's got these hugely popular books and she's on Netflix and all that stuff. But she is talking about shame and vulnerability and how those things limit us as individuals. And she is talking about that in a social context and about generational trauma and the ways things need to shift. And she is talking with and platforming people like Tarana Burke and Adrienne Maree Brown and others. Adrienne Maree Brown also, together with Sonia Renee Taylor, another Black American woman, did a thing called the Journal of Radical Permission.
Okay.
Again, that goes to self-practice, but the reason it's, they express it in terms of that self-practice of giving yourself permission being a radical act in the context of the culture that you live in.
Okay.
Especially as two black women in America, them giving themselves permission to live full, wholesome lives is a radical act, actually. So I think there are people having those conversations, but they're not necessarily framing it in the context of consent and consent culture. And frankly, I don't blame them, because I think a lot of my work gets dismissed as being about that very small niche thing.
Yeah.
Oh, she's talking about sex again. And I'm not. I am actually talking about a much bigger thing.
And that's why I wanted to ask you that, because, I mean, apologies if the way I framed that question before seemed in any way negative about the conversations about those, for instance, sex-based or kind of interpersonal relationships. That's very important. But to me, there's so many levels to it. And hearing you describe it in such an articulate way is really great, because I'm like, these are conversations that need to be happening as well. It's not an either or. It's not like we can have the interpersonal consent conversations, but consent is such a massive picture. Like when we were talking about it last month in Upwarding, and I mentioned that I didn't consent to Suella Braverman having this level of power over me or other immigrants into this country. We didn't consent to that, but here we are. So
democracy is not consensus. It's a whole other thing.
Yeah. It's a form of democracy that we currently live under.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I feel like that's another. This is a sidetrack, but I feel like the way we have, again, narrowly defined what quote unquote democracy means now, parliamentary democracy, that's not real democracy. And actually, I feel we're in a stage of civilization where the tools that we have could enable us to have a much more radical daily interaction with what democracy means, but we're not there yet because it's being withheld by this old system, which again, these are all, everything kind of, now that I think about it, so much stuff ties into consent. It really does. It's so broad. Yeah.
I'm glad you get it, Niall. I'm here, this Lone Ranger banging on about consent being the key to transforming so much, and people think I'm talking about sex, and I'm not. Sex is really important, and actually it is a place to be radical, and and it is really hard to have those conversations in an authentic way that's shrouded in shame and problems and stuff. So I'm not shying away from sexual consent at all, but it's like, if we could sort out sexual consent, we could change the entire world, is how I feel. And and like I say, the compass came about partly because the sexual consent models weren't working for me in the broader context of consent. Now, I've taken the consent compass model, for example, and I've started a conversation with Sandrine Monin. She's going to be on my I Do Consent podcast, actually, coming up. And Sandrine and I have been talking about consent culture as it could apply to dance, the dance industry, the dance world. And how in the dance industry, the great genius choreographer treats their dancers traditionally like they are machines at the great choreographer's bidding. And any dancer who wants to go, actually, I'm not comfortable with that, or I might get injured if I do that, or whatever, will not speak up because they fear that they won't get work and they'll be called a difficult dancer. So there's this huge traditional culture in dance of it being that way. So then if you start to apply, how do we change the culture of dance? If you start to apply the consent compass model to an arena like that, you start to come up with useful strategies for an innovative choreographer like Sandrine, who's creating dance with visually impaired dancers
Mhm.
and sighted dancers, for example, to really ensure that what's going on in her dance studio
Yeah.
is truly engaging and safe and comfortable and consensual for those people, and more people like her start to shift the culture of dance.
Mhm.
So if you can do that in kind of organizations, and this is one of the reasons I'm really excited to be working with Islington Mill, because I think Bill and Maury have been, and the rest of the team and community that is Islington Mill, are trying really hard to create a consent culture in that organization, in that building, and in the community around it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's so important. And I think that looking for organizations that are willing to do the work to try to model this and to try to unpack the thinking, the language, the assumptions about how you manage and organize, that are trying to unpack all of that and trying to work in a much more consensual way as a group of people. I think it's so important to have those models, and I'm really, really thrilled that Islington Mill is really a place that's trying to do that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, well, to wrap up then, what is going to be happening at the Mill for International Day of Consent? Can you tell us what you're going to do? What's happening?
Yes. So I'm doing 4 days of stuff for the Day of Consent, but the first of those days is the 30th of November, which is the actual International Day of Consent. And I'm in residence Thursday. I'm in residence at the Mill from about when I can get there at about 10:30 in the morning for kind of 24 hours.
Okay.
I am launching the Consent Compass on the Irregular website, my website, and on the I Do Consent, International Day of Consent website also. And I'm doing an online Q&A of that around lunchtime. But the main events that are kind of live at Islington Mill that people can engage with live rather than just online, at 5 p.m, I'm doing a consent circle, what I'm calling an irregular salon event. That it's myself, Betty Martin, who is the author of The Wheel of Consent, which, as I say, is a very well-established practice for embodied consent. And Rivka, who not only is a custodian of the Mill, but is also one of the founders of Upwarding, are going to have a conversation about consent together. And I think that will be a really interesting conversation about what consent is and how we practice it. Betty's going to talk through the Wheel of Consent. I'm going to talk through the compass, and Rivka's going to talk about language. And we are inviting a small number of people to join us. So if people who are in and around the Mill want to join that, they can email me. The details are on my website, which I'll give you for the podcast. And then there's another event happening at the Mill, which sounds really interesting, which is at 7. I am at 9:30 doing because first and foremost, I'm a performer, doing what I call Irregular Jen's solo variety show. My queer utopian story. So it's a largely improvised variety, comedy, serious spoken word music mashup of me doing a more kind of quirky and irregular interpretation of some of these themes. So it's not me talking about the dry theory. It's me talking about me and my life and how consent has woven in and out of it and how I've arrived at where I am and where I want to go. But hopefully doing that in a way that's fairly entertaining. So that's at the Mirage Bar at 9:30 on the 30th. Following that, there's a few more events. I'm doing some online training. There's podcasts being released. I'm doing a spoken word event in Shipley, where I live, which is near Bradford in West Yorkshire, in the local library with disabled and queer poets and writers on their view of consent as people with disabilities and neurodivergencies. So yeah, there's lots more going on, but at the Mill, I'm really pleased to be able to be there for that day. It feels like the right place to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now that I'm really looking forward to it now. I think the show notes for this podcast are going to be pretty epic because there's been so much interesting stuff to talk about. And I'll be putting in the links to like, is there an event page? I'll find out and I'll link everything. So that all the stuff who do want to come will be there.
Yeah. It's on, most of the events that are online, will be watchable via Facebook. I know Facebook's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's very accessible, broadly speaking. So Facebook's cool. The performance will be live streamed probably on YouTube. But anyway, I'll give you all the links, Niall, and you can share those for people who are interested.
Yes, that would be great. Right. Well, I think I'd really like to continue a conversation about this again at some point in the future. So I think like we will be talking again, I'm sure. And you might be doing more upwarding stuff again. So
I'm sure I'd love to come back
in the future. But this has been brilliant.
For sure.
Really, so much to think about, and so much and so much stuff. Yeah, it's really difficult, I think, in these fields talking about theoretical social stuff to make it not dry. But the way you're explaining it is just feels so relevant in terms of it's very practical. Actually, so I feel like this is a really engaging discussion about something that in other ways could seem quite dry. So this has been really exciting, really good podcast.
Oh, thank you, Niall. That's really good to hear because that is really, that's really my mission, is to make this idea of consent being this transformative force that we can all access. Just to make that accessible to more people is kind of the mission I'm on. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
And thanks again to Jen Wilson for being the guest on this month's Islington Mill and podcast. As we mentioned in the podcast, this coming Thursday, which is the 30th of November, International Day of Consent will be appearing at Islington Mill with a series of events throughout the day. I'll just give you a quick run through now. At 12 noon, Jen will be launching the Consent Compass in Finding Your Own Way, which will feature a premiere of the video introduction to this new framework for practicing consent, followed by a live question and answer session with Jen themselves. At 5 o'clock until 6:30, there will be a consent circle and a regular salon event, which will feature Jen, our very own Rivka Rubin from Upwarding, and also Betty Martin, creator of the internationally renowned framework, The Wheel of Consent. That'll be happening from 5 o'clock in the afternoon until 6:30. And then from 9:30 until 10:30 p.m, Jen will be presenting a live performance of My Queer Utopian Story, a solo variety show. And if you'd like to find out more information about the International Day of Consent in general, and also you can find the Consent Culture Manifesto, then I'm going to direct you to the website idoconsent.org, which is idoconsent.org. Highly recommend checking that page out. And until next month, in case I don't see you at this Thursday's International Day of Consent event at Islington Mill, it's ta-ra for me, and I'll be back with another I Am And podcast next month. Goodbye.